We're going to move forward now by taking a look at the possibilities for the future. This conversation will be led by an old friend of mine, Joe Ward of KPMG. He will bring to the stage Dan Hoffman, the first Chief Innovation Officer for Montgomery County, Maryland, and Todd Simpson of the Department of Health and Human Services. And you were promised an introduction to Decode 42, and you'll get that from Meg Vorlin. Please make them feel welcome. Joe, take it away.
Thank you, Francis. Appreciate it. Well, thank you and good morning. My name is Joe Ward. I'm a director with the Federal Shared Services practice at KPMG. And in the final panel today, here's what we want to do in terms of where we want to go. So far today, you've heard some perspectives on intelligent automation. You've got some great lessons learned from a panel of practitioners. And we kicked the morning off with a great video on what is intelligent automation and what is it not. So in the final panel today, we're going to talk about the future of intelligent automation in the federal government. In other words, where are we going? We've got a great panel today with 3 different perspectives. We have an executive level, cabinet level, agency perspective from Todd. We have a local government perspective from Dan. And we have a hybrid perspective from Megan with sort of a private sector and a government agency perspective. So before we actually get started, what I'd like to do is have the panel members tell you a little bit about themselves and what their experience is, and then we'll get into a few questions. So if we could start with Todd from my far left, and then we'll work our way back.
I'm Todd Simpson. I'm the Chief Information Officer at the Food and Drug Administration. I was previously with the Department of Transportation, and before that I was with the Department of Justice. I've been with the federal government now for about 7 years, and before that I spent 18 years in various capacities in the private sector, phone companies, county government, things like that.
Dan Hoffman, I'm the Chief Innovation Officer for Montgomery County, and what that means is I operate what we kind of refer to as the Research and Development Lab for the county. In terms of automation in the lab, we look at everything from the conversational computing automation that we've heard about earlier with Amazon Echo for vulnerable populations, to things that we're doing on public transportation around the ridership experience. Prior to Montgomery County, I was with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, where we worked on automation issues related to information and resiliency post-Fukushima.
My name is Meg Vorland. I'm the Director of Programs at Decode 42. Justin gave me a little intro earlier, but at Decode 42, I run a program that is an accelerator for emerging tech to get into the federal space. So I work with companies that have really great private sector traction that are looking to open up that federal channel. We run cohorts, so we run by vertical, and this current cohort is AI and machine learning. So I'm really excited to be here. Before that, I was at the U.S. Small Business Administration. So I have a little bit of that private sector with the previous public sector experience.
Great. So after hearing today's discussion and based on your own experience, how do you envision adoption of intelligent automation in the federal space? And in addition to that, who do you see taking the lead?
I can kick that one off. So in my role, we work a lot with government agencies. So we're listening to them and listening to what their challenges are, what their use cases are across the board. And what we are running AI and machine learning because that's what our federal partners have said that they want to see going forward. So when we talk about adoption, I think that we heard from some panelists a little bit earlier about that level 1 and how do you get in? And I think that level 1 is a great place to start. We have companies that will do basically bots. I scrape here, I pull here, I match those things up. But now we're seeing more and more on getting machine learning and AI underneath those. So learning, oh, I've already scraped there 3 times, now I don't have to. Or this step is actually not necessary. Let me pull that up to the forefront and tell the manager, whoever it is, that we should be cutting this step out completely. So I think it starts with the level 1, but I think that we should be looking towards the future and looking towards those AI and machine learning implementations.
And I think there's going to be those more transactional. We've heard a lot about shared services so far today, where you're automating something in the back end that's relatively straightforward. But there will also be, I think, a lot of those different business cases, use cases that are a little more complex. They're public facing. Earlier, you heard Dan Castro reference health inspections. We were one of the first jurisdictions, I think the second after Chicago, to incorporate some of these intelligent tools into health inspections. We've put a pause on it because we started to understand some of the policy and social and equity implications of these tools. So because we realized that in order to implement that particular tool, the way it was intended initially, we were going to have to inspect only certain types of restaurants in certain places during certain times of the year. And although that was an accurate risk model, it meant that we were going to have to only inspect Chinese restaurants in August next to a construction site. And we realized, well, we just can't do that. We can't only inspect those restaurants to get all of these wonderful gains. So now we're thinking about, well, how do we use this data in a more proactive way, in a way we hadn't initially anticipated, to be more proactive to prevent health violations. So I see it rolling out in iterations. We're going to learn some of these lessons, then we're going to have to dial it back, and having executive leadership that's patient, that understands that it's not always going to be this amazing march forward where you're going to save money and save lives every time, that occasionally you're going to have missteps and you're going to have to rethink things. That iterative process is going to be necessary as we roll out these tools.
And look, as you train models, it matters a lot how you're training them. And we're going to see that more and more in the government space, where there's just more of a keen eye put on whether you're going to have to go and talk to the Hill on how was this model trained and is it biased and who put that bias in, and being able to roll it back and see where those decisions were made and how they're made and what policies we can put in place to make sure that we're seeing that now instead of looking back and having to roll huge amounts of it back.
I agree with both Dan and Megan, and I think it's a good sign when you start learning and you have to kind of roll it back a little bit because it shows that you're making progress. And we're dealing with very similar challenges at the FDA, just ingesting and mulling over petabytes of data that are traversing our network every day, and trying to make sense of that data, and trying to buy the right tools and put the right processes in place so that we catch everything and actually save lives with the information that we're extrapolating.
So I'm curious, so in addition to the adoption of intelligent automation in the federal space, I'm curious on your thoughts on who should take the lead in adopting intelligent automation. And I'm curious how that matches up to our research, because based on our research, we've sort of found a hodgepodge in terms of the shared services organization, the business unit implementing the intelligent automation, executive management, et cetera. So I'm curious how that plays out in your respective areas in terms of who should take the lead.
I'll start with a very generic response and say, like any technology, AI or any kind of automation tool that you're going to put into place should be based on a requirements analysis. And at the FDA, we've put a governance process in place as part of our PMO so that every single investment has to have a business case, and there has to be an alternatives analysis associated with that business case. And we don't just start projects, we actually start proofs of concept in our innovation lab, and then they transition into projects. So the actual the pilot will take part after the proof of concept has assured us that there's something there to move forward with. So I think if you just apply that kind of business logic to any problem, I think you're going to find that 80% of your trouble is going to be behind you. It's just good planning, and of course do the risk analysis and everything like that. It becomes a little bit more cumbersome because it's kind of, you're dealing with unknowns, and you don't necessarily know what you're going to find when you start analyzing all that data. And that's the exciting part in a way, because when you start seeing those emerging trends and you can actually take actions and intervene, it's kind of an interesting nexus.
Building on what Todd was saying, when asked who should lead these things, there's requirements. It's got to come from a need. It's got to come from user interviews, from a design thinking approach. That's your bottom-up piece. It also needs that top-down leadership, because so many of these things have implications now that trickle across multiple sectors, whether it's your attorneys, finance, your information security folks, your HR group. Every one of those groups can basically bring things to a halt with one particular issue or concern that may or may not be based on real risk, more so hypothetical risk, doomsday scenarios that are highly, highly unlikely. So having executive leadership that understands that there is a degree of risk, we're going to take that, we're going to accept that risk. But we're going to move forward. That's incredibly important for executive leadership to play that role. But also, again, from the bottom up, it has to come from a real need. Don't let your executives get all hot and bothered over the shiny new thing and just say, well, we're going to go buy that tool. Why? Why would we do that? Because the folks in the bottom up, they're going to have their own fears, their own concerns. We heard about workforce issues, worried about losing their jobs. It has to come from both angles.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So I think that the executive level sponsorship, the executive level buy-in, specifically the executive level acceptance of the risk is really important. I think that we're seeing that across the board, program managers, the people who work in these fields all the time are the people who can see how this actually can connect the dots for them. And I think that those are the people who are going to be able to see those requirements, and maybe they see one type of technology and it helps, whether it's in workforce planning or onboarding, and they say, oh, now my realm of possible is a little bit different. Like, what if we use this same thing to do this thing over here? So I think that the requirements are really important, and the requirements are changing based on, I think, the workforce understanding this technology a little bit better, but also just seeing it implemented. And I think one other thing on the risk that comes to mind is the procurement risk. That these aren't, specifically when you're dealing with AI and machine learning companies, it's not the easiest to get them on board, to get those proof of concepts going. And how do you, as an agency, as a government entity, make it so that we can test these in small scenarios? We can do something around, maybe it's HR onboarding, maybe it's FOIA requests, maybe it's redaction. These are all things that can be automated. And how do you make it so that that proof of concept is really accessible, and we can figure out the ROI on the back end. We can figure out what the return is and how much it's actually helping. And because it's a little bit less about how much it's saving, but it's about how much it's helping. How much of your time would you have spent crossing letters out in a redaction exercise?
So in essence, you've all basically agreed that...
We'll disagree at some point.
Oh, I'm sure of that based on our discussion in the green room. But
No, we won't.
So you basically all agree then that not only active but visible leadership support is a critical success factor in adopting intelligent automation, and that's consistent with our research as well. So one of the questions we had earlier from the audience, from my good friend Al Sample from the Program Support Center, was, how do you get started? So you see the benefits of intelligent automation, you understand what class 1, class 2, class 3 is, et cetera. How do you get started?
I want to jump in on that one. So we've heard proof of concept so far in the conversation. We've heard pilot. Years ago, the big, in IT, there was a waterfall versus agile. We've been making this transition to minimum necessary build, iterative design thinking. We've been making this transition for a long time. And we're now at a point, I think, where the technology in many cases has caught up with our own processes. And we can actually do these things. We're not trying to do Agile with a large ERP implementation anymore. We're doing it with actual cloud-based tools that are ready to be Agile. So as you're thinking about those steps, proof of concept or prototype, proof of concept, pilot, just make sure every step adds value. Requirements and planning, can add value. It can also be a bridge to nowhere as you develop, an encyclopedia of everything that could go right, could go wrong, risk logs. If you over project manage something, those are the types of things that they get you bogged down. So just start doing it. Make it real to folks. Let them get their hands wet with it. But every step should add some value. It should answer some question. I think that's, as long as people are seeing that value and they're getting their hands on it, then these things move forward naturally.
And I would say, we heard from a panelist earlier, jump in. There are amazing technologies in the private sector right now that are doing this. And they're doing this for some of the biggest companies. They're doing it for medium-sized companies. They're doing it for small companies. And it's working. So I know that there's some additional risk. There's many more hurdles on the government side. But there are really great companies out there doing it and ready to kind of make that transition over into the government space. And they understand the requirements in the government space are different, slightly different. Mm-hmm. They understand the hurdles that they need to jump over, and they're ready.
So I guess from my perspective, how to get started at the FDA, it's maybe slightly we have to do kind of the groundwork with the basic business artifacts, oftentimes just to get everyone on board. It's a highly federated environment at the FDA. There are 9 centers and each center has their own budget authority. And so I find myself in more of a diplomatic role than more of a dictatorial role. So through centralized governance and instead of saying you have to do it this way, what I've tried to do is define the road that we're all going to drive down. But getting started is actually a little bit trickier. As some may know, we have an informatics program at the FDA. And it's led by the Office of the Chief Scientist. And I think that outside of the Office of the Chief Scientist, there are informatics activities going on in all of the different centers. So my challenge, I think, becomes not only connecting with the technologies abroad, but also connecting with my customers inside and really getting to them and understanding their needs. And using the tools that I mentioned before, especially the PMO, to ensure that we don't duplicate and make the same investments multiple times, essentially, or get technologies that compete, and then at the end of the day, we have 9 different things that do the exact same thing. So that's been kind of the challenge, I think, that I've been dealing with.
I think there's a couple, there's 2 things that brings to mind. One is that there are a lot of agencies that have dipped their toe in. There's some agencies that are further along, but they have really good lessons learned. And I know we heard a little bit earlier someone saying that if you're just taking your paper-based process and you're automating it, you're doing it wrong. While I agree in theory, sometimes that paper-based process and putting it into an automated process and then looking and actually seeing how messed up it is and how many times it goes to Gary up in legal really is the turning point for the whole group to bring the whole group along to say, look, this was our process. Can you believe we did it this way? And it gives you a good visual and kind of a good way to kind of bring it along as a community and then say, okay, you all touch this one process. how can we do it better? Now you own it, you do it better. So we've seen some of the implementation actually works well when you do it that old way, and then you see how terrible that is, and you're able to actually iterate and innovate on that process.
I don't know how deep down this rabbit hole we should go, but I can't tell you how many times in the federal government I get called into a room and everybody says, oh, we have an IT problem, and I say, no, you have a business problem. Your processes are just a mess. And I have a Six Sigma background, so it's, in the beginning days when I first came to the government, I was twitchy when I saw certain things because I was like, oh my God, look, you have a person there doing this, and then you have another person on top of that. And so you see a lot of that in the federal government. So I completely agree that just automating processes. Now, that said, at the FDA, to kind of position ourselves and build trust with our end users, I had to do certain things to show them that I was, 100% committed and listening. So I tried to attack the low-hanging fruit, and we automated all of our field inspection and audit processes. So we don't do any paper inspections anymore. We don't. Everything is done electronically, and we've leveraged it against a CYOD program that I set up, where everything's done on tablets. And to Megan's point, we're ingesting a ton more of electronic data, but it's time to actually start, using the I think the AI tools to make more sense of that data. Not that we're not, but I think there's definitely more momentum needed.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that there are little steps that certainly need to be taken in the short run, but you're right. If you're doing automation without any type of back-end machine learning or AI, that's the future. That's where you need to be thinking about, and because we talked about how the data is just piling up and piling up and piling up, and we need to have something that can comb through that.
So hold that thought on the data.
Okay.
Data depends on where you're from.
Chicago, sorry.
Yeah, tomato, right? So that's great. So we've talked about adoption. We've talked about how to get started, and that's all great. So the next question is, what specific areas within your portfolios do you think make good sense for intelligent automation?
We can beat the shared services drum again, but
Of course.
There's that. I'll just leave it at that. There's those functions. We know what those functions are. So those are obvious transactional ones. I'm at this point with a local government, providing services. I think we're looking at the elements where we are trying to reach people that previously it was very expensive or very labor intensive to reach. Immigrant populations, seniors aging in place out in suburbia. Looking at tools that can automate a check-in with a senior that's in their home, they're isolated. We may send a nurse out 2 or 3 times a week to check on them because they're waiting for a placement in an assisted living facility. It's very expensive for us to send a home care nurse out 3 times a week. Could we do that once a week and then put an Amazon Echo in their house or Google Home? Not to be vendor. I don't want to endorse any one vendor, but can we put a device in their home that will provide a greater level of service, so actually improve their quality of life, but at the same time actually kind of automate a process that was highly manual and to some degree high touch? And how do we do that? So that's the kind of thing that I see as relatively, that's worthy of the R&D lab at this point. I think a lot of the stuff we're talking about when you're dealing with finance or HR, it's very transactional. It's almost a commodity now, where it's been done, there's lessons learned, you can do it. You can hire somebody with relative confidence to do it for you. I think at this point, the panacea is starting to actually reach out and help people live happier lives through some of these more labor-intensive, high-touch services.
Yeah, I think that, so I work with one technology where they do keywords, and they do keywords in a really specific way that just makes the realm a lot bigger of what you're searching. And they always say it's not about having more data ingested. It's about it actually changes the answer to some of these national security problems, right? So it's not just about, oh, I used AI or I used machine learning on the back end or I used automation, but we're getting different answers and we're able to react to different challenges, whether that is in the intelligence community space or in the Defense Department, where we wouldn't have gotten that answer before. And I think that's where I think it's really exciting. That's where it's exciting in a lot of places. So I don't want to just say that it's only exciting in the IC community, but that's one example. And I think they're fairly far along in that. But you look at HHS and the amounts of data that come into HHS. We had someone from Commerce here earlier. Commerce is just hordes of data between census and NOAA. And when you get all of that and you ingest all of that, how are we making decisions differently? How are we actually using that data, not just to run it through the same old process, but to make different decisions and be able to go down a different route?
So Megan, you mentioned the HHS data, and between NIH and FDA, we consume 80% of the bandwidth at the TIC. So at the Trusted Internet Connection. So most of that data coming in is either FDA or NIH data. I mean, that's just that. And so all of that data needs to be maintained, inventoried, understood, and it needs to be analyzed. And so that's like one aspect. And then we have the shared services aspect where we're trying to do automation to basically reduce the human cost of doing business. So if we can give the ability to one of our customers to spin up their own server by just clicking a button, a pre-programmed menu of everything that they need, we clearly we've made those investments as well. So we've got kind of the shared services, we've got the internal piece, and then we have an external piece, with like Open FDA and trying to give ingestible data to the American public and to give the American public data that they can actually make sense out of. And I know earlier we were talking about just the quantums of data, not just the genomic data that we're bringing in and the sequencing that we're doing there, because it really, I don't think, is the AI argument. It's the other stuff. It's the trending. It's the stuff that, somebody is using a drug that may potentially kill them, and, the FDA may have blocked for some reason because it's lethal, but that drug may keep someone in a state of normality for the last 6 months of their lives. So, you may not find that data if you're not looking in the right place, because sometimes that data is on Facebook, it's in social media, it's in Twitter or somewhere, and so it's combing through all that and applying the right tool set and the right direction to get the maximum amount of value. And again, there are people much smarter than me working on this stuff at the FDA. The scientists there are geniuses, as well as the regulators. So that's their business, and but I agree completely.
So all three of you have talked a lot about data, okay? And I said I'd come back to this. So let's explore that just a little bit deeper. So we know that approximately 90% of the digital data, of all digital data, has been created over about the last two or so years. And that's true in public and private sector. But only about 1% of that data has actually been reviewed, okay? So the big question is, if 90% of this data has been digital data has been created over the last 2 years, and only 1% has actually been collected and analyzed and reviewed, what are your thoughts and what are your plans on managing this 600-pound gorilla going forward and translating that data into something that decision makers can use for the public good and that taxpayers and stakeholders can benefit from?
So there's two pieces to that, right? There's the inventory. What do I have? What is it? Is it clean? Is it reliable? There's those types. There's that piece to your question, and then there's the how does it get used, ingested. The two sides to that. The one side is we have 5 full-time people that just do data work, That may not sound like a lot, but for a local government, it's a lot. And if you are, Des Moines, Iowa, you probably don't have 5 people working full-time on open data or data inventories. And that's not even including our performance management group, which also plays a huge data role, and that's another 5 full-time people. Montgomery County is lucky enough to invest a lot into that. I think for this to really get some widespread traction at the local and state level, it's going to take a lot of thoughtful standards and taxonomies and guidance from the feds who can start to give us, bring a lot of these local jurisdictions together. NIST plays an incredibly important role in doing that. We work closely with NIST because I think with that guidance, it makes it a lot easier for a lot of these local jurisdictions who are creating a lot of the data that then gets rolled up to groups like HHS or transportation at the federal level. The other side of it is how can we make it actionable, digestible? That's a design thinking question. That is a question of what do you need, when do you need it, what do you need it to look like, and really what questions do you need answered? We've done at the local level open data town halls to ask residents, what do you want to do? We don't ask them what data set do you want. What do you want to do? Or what action would you like us to do? And then we fill in the blank with what data we know and have inventoried. So you have to, I think about it from those 2 different perspectives.
So the first 2 words that came to mind with your question were data lakes. That's what I immediately started thinking because, I think that when I first started in IT a long, long time ago, it was very much inventory and understanding and having kind of that taxonomy and that dictionary of standard terms. And we didn't talk about data harmonization, we talked about data standardization, and we talked about schemas. And I think that big data, or big data, depending on where you came from, really changed all that. And I don't think that, the inventory piece, we have to understand what we have, but I don't think the inventory piece and the schema, I don't think it's as important or as relevant, especially when you look at the problem from the unstructured data vantage point and what you don't know that's out there, because there's no way to inventory what you don't know is out there. You're looking for it, you're trying to ingest it. So I think that when you're dealing with taxonomies and schemas, it's very, very challenging to overcome silos, especially territorial silos. You used to see it with GIS data. I don't know how relevant that is nowadays. I don't really do much GIS, but I think that if you look at the data as one giant asset, and you apply the right tools at looking at that data, you can kind of get rid of some of those nuances that used to kind of make us work a little harder. And through the application of AI tools, let it do the work for you and do the trending and the analytics. And I never thought I would say this, but the bat computer that spits out the little answer at the end, who would have thought, So.
And so where we see this data problem going is hopefully this makes it so that we have better shared data, where we have DoD talking to DHS in a more meaningful way, and in a way that maybe it's not just here you have access, but here we can run our same types of algorithms, same types of machine learning, AI, bots, whatever they are, on joint data. Because we're going, again, this to me comes back to getting better answers, asking better questions and getting better answers. And I think we're getting better at figuring out what the realm of possible is and what are the next questions that we want answers to. But the more that we can combine these, we have a wealth of information. We just need to be able to use it intelligently.
So this administration has placed an emphasis on improving efficiency. The president came out with an executive order on the 13th of March, Executive Order 13781, that talked about improving efficiency in cabinet level agencies, reducing redundancies, eliminating duplication, looking at workforce size, and reducing workforce in the short term and the long term, et cetera. And that executive order was followed up by an OMB memorandum 1722 about a month or so later that gave agencies specific details on how to draft their agency reform plans, which have to be submitted to OMB. Well, the high-level plan is due on the 30th of June, and the final plan is due on the 8th of September. With that in mind, what do you all see as some of the keys, as some of the critical success factors in terms of driving efficiency within federal agencies?
So I'll take the first bite of this apple. I'm familiar with 1722. It's pretty much been the vein of our existence for the last, I would say, month or so. And I've been working with my colleagues at HHS, meeting mostly with my peers at NIH and the other optives, CDC and CMS specifically, because they're larger in scope and more comparable to FDA, but also with some of the smaller optives. And we were given the task to reimagine the federal government. And it was actually, my hopes are up, I have to admit, because we were given a forum to kind of come in and kind of articulate all of the things that we didn't think were working in the federal government, from procurement to HR and to IT. And you can't have an HR conversation without having the IT conversation and the procurement conversation. So when I came back to the FDA and I talked to my peers who were working in similar groups at HHS with their peers, the HR people were talking about, HRMS and, these enterprise resource or enterprise systems for HR that were contingent on IT. And the IT people were talking about the workforce issues that were created, from not being able to, get to the right people quickly. And of course the procurement issues, the acquisition issues that plague us all. So we put pretty much everything on the table, and I don't think there were any topics that were sacred. We were allowed to really put everything out there, and it was a really comfortable, safe exercise. And I think we made a lot of recommendations back that will be in the final report that I think will, if they're followed, bring about a lot of change and add a lot of value and a lot of efficiencies. Now, it's still, I think, going to take a long road, but I think that the data is there, at least what we should be doing is there, and so it's the way it is and the way it ought to be kind of thing. So we know how it ought to be, and we'll see if we can get there.
I'm going to talk about procurement because it's if you're a local, state, or federal public sector agency, you have procurement regulations. And when thinking about this, I'll say the tone and tenor of those, because obviously that OMB memo doesn't really apply to Montgomery County, Maryland. But when especially private sector voices come to me and say, you got to fix procurement, procurement's broken, I bristle at that. I think all of these efficiency things, you've got to balance is with what are we actually trying to do here? Do you just not like it? Because, get over it. We're never going to go to a system where, hey, you know what, vendor, let me just write you a check. I like you. You came in, you met with me. You can't take me out to lunch, but, we have some friends in common, or maybe I used to work there. No, we don't want to go back to a system where there's not open procurements. I'm sure there's no vendor in this room that works with the federal government that would say, I would totally like to give up my right to protest. Let's just do away with all protests because you know what, that'll make things a lot easier. No, you want to have, of course, efficient, but you need to have open and transparent procurements. And you're never going to do that without some degree of ask. Here's what we want. Here's an RFP. Everybody, you have an equal chance of competing for this work. A period of time to respond. Some of these things, it just takes longer because we have to be, as government folks, we have to be stewards of the public trust. We can't go back to a system where people are giving work to their brother-in-law. And that's a real risk. We've seen that. We've learned that lesson. So some of these things will always be a little longer than we want them to be. So when you come to me and talk about procurement, don't tell me it's broken. Say, hey, you know what, yes, it can be improved. Here's how I would improve it, maybe to either make it faster or more effective. And a lot of things we've been talking about today they make our procurements not necessarily faster. This iterative process of proof, concept, pilot, prototype, it doesn't necessarily make it faster. It increases our likelihood of success at the end of the day. So when you talk about procurement, just understand, what are you asking us to do? What do you want to get out of it? Just a memo that says we're going to cut regulations. Well, why are you asking to do that? Like, is it to create more effectiveness or efficiency, or is it just because you don't like it? That's my soapbox.
If I can just comment on what Dan said, I 100% agree. When I was in my MPA program a long, long time ago, it was all about running government like a business. And I came into government, I was very frustrated, more like a bull in a china shop, I would say, in my first year. And I'm firing feds, and it's almost unheard of to do such a thing. And I was like, why wouldn't I? Progressive discipline, let's move, so I would say that over the last 7 years, I never thought I would say this, but government is government. It's not business. It is
Yes.
government, and there is a bureaucracy there that is designed to protect the American people. So I completely agree. So some of the things that we talked about were within the confines of the fair and competitive system, setting up more BPAs. So we inside have quicker access, better mechanisms in place to quickly buy cloud services or to buy whatever we want to buy. So those types of mechanisms. And so once you've done the vetting, I think there are some lower level things, and that's really where the group of CIOs that were part of that reimagining effort really focused. It was strategic, but we got very tactical with real world solutions, like what services really should be at the highest shared service level. In my opinion, I don't understand why we have so many mail servers or mail environments in the federal government. Why not just one? Why not just one AD environment? Why not just one network? Why not just one security model? It would make things a lot easier. It would secure us a lot more, and it would drive costs. It would change everything. But I think I'm kind of in the minority on that, and you'll hear people come in and say, oh, we're so different. We have these nuances, and I can definitely appreciate that. But there comes a time when you have to look at some of these shared services, from an economy of scale standpoint, and there's just really no reason why at the FDA, I spent the last 2 years standing up a cloud brokerage model with 6 different cloud service providers, and I did all the acquisition work and all the policy work to put that in place so that my scientists could access these environments when they needed to do the work they needed to do. But now NIH has to do the same thing, and CDC has to do the same thing, and so on and so forth, and Marshals and Commerce and everyone else. So where does it end? And I think that we need that to change.